Are your students falling asleep during your lectures? Maybe your PowerPoint slides are the problem. Welcome back to That's Academic. My name is Stephen Thomson, and I'm bringing you videos, interviews, and hacks for academics. Now, if you are teaching students in a lecture setting or maybe a seminar setting, what are your PowerPoints doing for your lecture? Are they supporting your lecture or are they a distraction? Because if your students are making memes about your PowerPoint slides on TikTok, don't tell anyone, but I don't even know what that means, then maybe you need to think about redoing or restyling your approach to PowerPoint slides. So in this video, I'm going to give you 5 tips to improve your PowerPoint slides and improve student engagement during your PowerPoint presentations. And in another video later, I'm going to give you 5 more tips to keep those aspects of your PowerPoint delivery improving. Now, before I get into today's 5 tips for improving your PowerPoint slides and making sure that your PowerPoints are promoting and not impeding the message that you're trying to get across to your students, I think it's worth just taking an initial step back and asking the question of whether you need to have PowerPoint slides in the first place. Now, what I'm talking about today does not just apply to PowerPoint presentations to students in a teaching setting. You can also adapt this to the use of PowerPoints in a research scenario. Maybe you're giving a research seminar or something like this, even a conference presentation. But really my focus here is on the teaching aspect, because PowerPoint slides are now a ubiquitous aspect of teaching. And I guess if you turn up to a lecture without PowerPoint slides, the students might be quite surprised because they just expect that they're getting that visual cue. But I think the first thing to do is to work out whether PowerPoint slides are actually necessary or not. I know that personally speaking, at conferences, and this will depend on the format of the conference and the layout of the conference, and of course so much these days is done online. But I often don't have PowerPoint slides at conference presentations. And I think immediately that just differentiates me from a number of other people who are presenting at conferences. That does not mean that PowerPoint slides don't serve a useful purpose in a conference presentation or don't add anything to the presentation. But I think what it really boils down to is what your PowerPoint slides are doing. Again, if they're supporting the conveyance and the delivery of your underlying message, or if actually they're a distraction and they're just getting in the way or sending people to sleep. So before you think about how to optimize your use of PowerPoint slides, have a think about whether you even need to use them in the first place in a lecture setting. Don't just do it because everyone else does it. Obviously, your institution might have expectations in this regard, and different groups of students might also have expectations in this regard too. But to the extent that this is your choice, you should choose whether or not to use PowerPoints in that setting. So the first tip seems absolutely obvious, but how often do you see other people's PowerPoints failing even to meet this criterion? Make the slides legible. Now, legibility comes down to a number of different factors. An obvious one is font size, because obviously you've got to think about the difference between the size of your computer screen when you're actually making the PowerPoint slides in the first place and the size of the screen onto which these slides might be projected, because that can vary enormously. It could be a small seminar room that you're in or a very large lecture theatre with a huge screen. And if the font size is simply too small, you're going to see the students, peering at the text and trying to decipher it. Now, apart from the fact that that's just annoying and your students immediately are going to resent you, it means that your students are not even listening to you. because they're spending their time trying to work out what the slides say. And, I see so many PowerPoint presentations, and I'm sure you do too, where actually your attention is not so much on the speaker, it's more on the slides. And that is not always for a good reason. In fact, I think a lot of the time it's for a bad reason. So make sure that the text size is appropriate. Also make sure that the colours which are used are appropriate. You don't want to have screaming contrasts, neon bright colours or anything like this. This should be easy on the eyes. It should not be more difficult to read. Be particularly wary about dark backgrounds and lighter colours of text. And also be sensitive to the fact that you might have students who are visually impaired in some way, including difficulties deciphering different combinations of colours. So it doesn't just have to be black and white, but make sure that the contrast and the colours are easy on the eyes and don't complicate things in that respect. Also think about the font that you're using for that text. Now, you want to use fairly plain fonts like serif or sans serif fonts because they're quite easy for the eye to read, okay? What you absolutely do not want to do is to use script or handwriting fonts because those are just so hard to read, and again, they just serve as a distraction. Your slides are supposed to be there as an aid to communication, not an impediment to communication. But also, don't go too far on the kind of, don't go into the monospaced fonts, which are really dull and blocky and just look awful, like kind of old typewriter fonts or something like this. So, use serif and sans serif fonts like Arial and those kind of standard fonts that are just easy to read. Now, again, that might seem obvious, but I think we've all seen PowerPoint presentations which fail to meet this most basic of criteria. So the second tip that I'm going to give you is to say to keep the text on the slides concise. Now again, how often do you see, or how often do students see, a lecturer come into the room and the PowerPoint slides are just stuffed with text? Now, what really, really matters here is quality over quantity. And there are a number of reasons why you should not be stuffing your slides with text. The first point is, again, it serves as a distraction. Because instead of listening to what you're saying, your students are reading the slides. Now, I'll come back in a moment to the point about reading from the slides, because you don't want to do that either. But when I'm giving a lecture, for example, I don't really want my students to all be looking at the slides and reading those. I want them to be listening to what I have to say. Because if they're reading blocks of text, you cannot read text and listen to someone and follow both at the same time. So if I lose their attention because they're busy reading a block of text, and then they switch their attention back to me, the flow of what I have been saying is interrupted, and they then have to kind of play catch up to keep up with what it is I'm saying. Okay, so again, large blocks of text are really a distraction for the students. Now, there are sometimes exceptions to this. You might have, a quotation or something like this. And, at those moments, I think it is permissible and appropriate to put that quotation on the slide. It might involve a block of text, and you can even read from that because you're giving a quotation from some kind of primary or secondary source. But so far as your points and your lecture is concerned, you absolutely should not have lots and lots of text stuffed into the slides. Keep it concise, keep it to a minimum, use bullet points, okay? Because the other thing that you don't want to do is to be reading from your slides. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. But the more text you have, the more of what you want to say that is kind of put onto the slide, the harder it will be for you as a lecturer to resist the temptation simply to read from the slide. So you absolutely don't want to do this. It's not good for you because it becomes a crutch for you and a distraction for you, and also it's a distraction for the students. And that takes us into the third tip for an effective PowerPoint presentation. Do not read from the slides. This is a surefire way to send your students to sleep and to have them looking at the clock saying, when is this nightmare going to be over? Because I'm looking forward to doing, anything that comes after this lecture. You're not going to engage people if you are simply reading from slides. And we've all seen people do this, including people who are, long-established teachers and academics. This is not what slides are for. It's not a script, and it's not a replacement for your lecture notes. Now, another time I will talk about lecture notes, because I try to have, if I can have no lecture notes, I prefer to do that, actually. But sometimes you need, a minimum of lecture notes, whether it's just to kind of keep you on track in terms of the structure, or there might be some things that are more difficult to actually remember or memorize, like a quotation or maybe a formula or something like this. But please absolutely resist the temptation to read from the slides. That is just a complete recipe for an ineffective PowerPoint presentation. And again, as I said in the last tip, the more concise your text is, the less text you have on those slides, the less likely you are to fall into this extremely common trap of simply reading from the slides like a script. Please don't do it. The fourth tip relates to structure. Now, I've said that you should not really have too much text on each slide, and that is true. And I think the use of bullet points can be quite helpful because, it kind of serves as a hook, an organizing hook. And the students can look at that and they can finish reading it quite quickly. And then their attention comes back to me as the lecturer and listening to what I have to say. But there's so much you can do for structure to maximize and to optimize the effectiveness of your PowerPoint slides in a lecture and teaching setting. And I will say more in another video about that. But the one thing I want to say here about structure is that generally speaking, if you are changing direction in your lecture, or you're introducing quite a new point or a new perspective, generally speaking, I think you should carry that over to a new slide. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that you can only have 1 point per slide or 1 bullet point per slide, but it's all about striking a balance between, not having too many slides, but ensuring that the structure of your presentation is optimized by actually kind of appropriately spacing and pacing the introduction of new ideas on new subsequent slides. I think that's quite a simple tip to improve the structure and to optimize the effectiveness of your PowerPoint presentations. Tip number 5, consider using graphics and images. Now, don't go over the top here and don't resort to kind of cheap clip art type images. The literature shows that actually graphics can be very useful as an aid to memory and an aid to engagement. Again, it doesn't mean that you should have kind of lots of pictures or lots of images, nor does it mean that you should necessarily be replacing text with images. But I find that having some ideas or concepts represented in an image or graphical form can actually really help to convey the underlying concept or idea. So my subject area is law, and law is not really an area which lends itself to graphical representation in the way that some other disciplines might. But I do still use images. So I might be comparing two types of legal case, for example, which have different kinds of structures. And what I might do is to represent that in an image or graphical form, because students are interested in that image. They're interested in what that image represents, and they want to hear me walking them through what that image represents. So I think this can be a really good way to keep students engaged, and also to, as an aid to memory for students. It's well documented also that the more colourful images are, or the more graphic they are, and of course they should be graphic within reason, or the more unusual they are, the easier they are to remember. So if you use graphics and images appropriately in your lecture slides, I think you can work wonders for student engagement and the attention that they pay to you as a lecturer in a teaching context. But again, don't go over the top. So those are 5 initial tips that I would like to give you to increase and to optimize the effectiveness of your PowerPoint slides in a teaching setting. Now, in another video, I'm going to walk you through other tips because clearly there is more that you can do to produce better PowerPoint slides in a lecture or teaching delivery setting. But remember, when you're making your PowerPoint slides, if you think PowerPoint slides are appropriate to the objectives that you're trying to achieve in the classroom, always see things from the student's perspective. And anytime you're adding text or you're selecting colors or fonts or number of slides or anything like this, keep the question in mind: is this helping or hindering my presentation? Is this promoting and facilitating and supporting the message that I'm trying to convey to students? Or is this a distraction which is getting in the way? So I hope you found those 5 tips useful. As I say, there are more tips coming in other videos. And if you find this video or this channel interesting or insightful, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, or letting others know who might find these videos to be useful. I'm looking forward to speaking to you in the next episode. Thank you so much.